The little girl was lying motionless on the polished marble floor of one of the most powerful corporate headquarters in the city, while dozens of employees stood frozen around her. Her mother, a billionaire CEO who had faced hostile takeovers, courtroom battles, and ruthless competitors without shedding a tear, was now on her knees, desperately begging a stranger to save her daughter. Nobody understood why the quiet single father who had been carrying a toolbox through the lobby suddenly dropped everything and rushed forward. But the moment he saw the girl's pale face and recognized the signs of a rapidly worsening emergency, something inside him changed. Years of military training that he had buried beneath an ordinary life came rushing back. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of one person choosing to help another, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel Wisdom Story House. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories like this to you. It was a bright weekday afternoon, the kind of clear day when sunlight poured through the enormous glass windows of the Meridian Tower and made the entire lobby look almost unreal. 38-year-old Callan Mercer stood near the security desk wearing a simple navy work shirt, faded black cargo pants, and worn brown boots. His dark hair was cut short, and a thin scar ran along the edge of his left eyebrow, barely visible unless someone looked closely. To everyone around him, Callan was simply a maintenance technician who had arrived to repair an electrical problem on the 26th floor. Nobody knew that before becoming a single father, he had served as a highly trained Navy SEAL, spending years learning how to remain calm when everyone else was losing control. He had left that life behind after his wife died unexpectedly, deciding that his 7-year-old son, Micah, needed a father more than the military needed another operator. Callan had spent the last 4 years deliberately building an ordinary life. He fixed broken machinery, repaired elevators, replaced wiring, and came home every evening to cook dinner for his son. He had learned how to braid hair for school spirit days, how to remove grass stains from uniforms, and how to sit beside a frightened child during thunderstorms without admitting that he was sometimes frightened too. His military medals were locked inside an old wooden box at the back of his closet. His former teammates occasionally contacted him, but Callan rarely answered. He wanted no more missions, no more violence, and no more nights wondering whether someone would come home. Then, at 2:17 in the afternoon, everything changed. A sharp cry suddenly echoed across the Meridian Tower lobby. Callan turned immediately. A little girl in a pale blue dress had collapsed beside a large decorative planter. Her mother was kneeling beside her, desperately trying to wake her. The woman was 39-year-old Serafina Vale, founder and CEO of Vale Horizon Technologies, one of the city's most successful companies. She was famous for her confidence and impossible standards, but the woman Callan saw now looked nothing like the powerful executive whose photograph appeared on business magazines. Serafina's hands were trembling as she tried to lift her daughter. The child, 9-year-old Alara Vale, had become frighteningly pale. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. A crowd began gathering, but nobody seemed to know what to do. One employee was calling emergency services while another shouted for security. Someone suggested giving the girl water. Another person tried to move her into a sitting position. Callan's instincts immediately told him not to let anyone move her unnecessarily. He pushed through the crowd and dropped beside the child. His eyes moved rapidly across her face, chest, and hands. He checked her breathing and pulse, then looked toward the security officer and instructed him to clear the area and keep the entrance open for paramedics. His voice was calm, controlled, and unmistakably authoritative. Serafina stared at him, confused and terrified. She recognized him vaguely as one of the maintenance workers, but at that moment she did not care who he was. She only saw someone who seemed to know what he was doing. Callan noticed something that others had missed. Alara's lips were becoming discolored, and her breathing pattern suggested that the problem was more serious than simple fainting. He asked whether she had any known allergies or medical conditions. Serafina struggled to answer because panic had taken over her mind. She finally remembered that Alara had complained of feeling strange shortly after eating a snack in the executive lounge. Callan immediately understood that time mattered. He instructed everyone nearby to stop crowding the child and watched carefully for changes in her condition. He did not pretend to be a doctor. Instead, he relied on his emergency training and focused on keeping the situation stable until professional medical help arrived. He spoke calmly to Alara even though her eyes remained closed, telling her that help was coming and that she needed to keep breathing. For a few terrifying seconds, Alara's breathing became even weaker. Serafina broke down. She grabbed Callan's sleeve with both hands, tears streaming down her face, and begged him to save her daughter. Callan looked at the terrified mother and saw something he had seen before on battlefields, a parent realizing that the person they loved most might disappear before their eyes. For a brief moment, his mind flashed back to another terrible day, another helpless feeling, another person he could not save. He forced the memory away. This was not the past. This was a child in front of him who still had a chance. Callan stayed focused. He instructed the security team to guide the paramedics directly through the lobby and keep the elevator clear. When the emergency crew arrived, Callan quickly explained what he had observed, what had happened before the collapse, and how the girl's condition had changed. The paramedics immediately took over. Serafina followed them toward the ambulance, but before she could climb inside, she turned back toward Callan. For the first time, she noticed the scar on his eyebrow and the strange steadiness in his eyes. She asked him to come with them. Callan initially refused. He had no reason to become involved in the life of a wealthy stranger. But then he saw Serafina standing alone beside the ambulance, looking like a mother who had suddenly become terrified of the future. He thought of Micah. He got into the ambulance. At the hospital, doctors rushed Alara into treatment. Serafina sat in the waiting room with her hands clasped tightly together. Callan remained several feet away, uncomfortable in a world of expensive suits, polished shoes, and people who seemed to know exactly who Serafina Vale was. After nearly an hour, a physician finally emerged and explained that Alara was stable and receiving treatment. The danger had been recognized quickly enough to make a major difference. Serafina closed her eyes and cried silently. Callan quietly stood and prepared to leave. But before he reached the doors, Serafina stopped him. She wanted to know who he really was. Callan simply told her he was a maintenance technician and a father. She asked why he had reacted so quickly. He hesitated before admitting that he had military emergency response training. Serafina immediately understood that there was far more to him than he had revealed. Still, Callan refused to discuss his military past. He returned home that evening to find Micah waiting at the kitchen table with a school project spread across the surface. The boy looked up and immediately noticed that his father seemed distracted. Callan smiled and told him everything was okay. But that night, after Micah went to bed, Callan sat alone in the kitchen and stared at the old wooden box containing his medals. He had spent years trying to convince himself that the man he used to be was gone. Yet when Alara collapsed, that man had returned without hesitation. The following morning, Serafina arrived at Callan's small home unexpectedly. She had learned where he lived through the maintenance company and came personally to thank him. Callan was uncomfortable with the attention, especially when she offered him money. He refused. Serafina insisted that she wasn't trying to buy his help. She simply wanted to repay a debt that could never truly be repaid. Callan told her that no parent should have to watch their child suffer alone. Those words stayed with Serafina. Over the next several weeks, their lives began crossing more often. Serafina discovered that Callan was raising Micah alone and worked long hours to keep their modest home. Callan discovered that behind Serafina's expensive clothes and intimidating reputation was a mother who had built her entire career around creating security for her daughter. But Serafina had enemies. Her company was facing a serious internal crisis. Someone had been leaking confidential information, and several major investors were threatening to withdraw. At first, Callan wanted nothing to do with it. He had no interest in corporate politics. Then one afternoon, Micah mentioned something that made Callan suspicious. A man had been watching their house from a parked vehicle. Callan remembered seeing the same vehicle near Meridian Tower. His old instincts returned. He began quietly observing patterns without interfering. He noticed that someone had been following Serafina's routine. He warned her to increase security around Alara and Micah, but he refused to explain how he had noticed the danger so quickly. Serafina finally realized that the man who had saved her daughter was not merely a former soldier. He was someone trained to recognize threats before ordinary people even realized they existed. The situation became more dangerous when Alara disappeared briefly from a school pickup area. She was found only minutes later inside a nearby bookstore, frightened but unharmed. Security had no explanation for how she had slipped away from the designated pickup zone. Callan immediately understood that this was not random. Someone was testing the family's security. That evening, he told Serafina that she could no longer assume the danger was limited to her business. Serafina was terrified. For the first time, the CEO who had spent years believing she could solve every problem with determination realized that some threats could not be defeated alone. Callan helped her strengthen the family's safety procedures while remaining careful not to cross legal boundaries or take matters into his own hands. His greatest lesson from military service had never been about fighting. It had been about protecting people without becoming consumed by fear. Eventually, investigators uncovered the truth. A senior executive inside Serafina's company had been leaking information to a competitor and had attempted to create chaos around the family to pressure Serafina into selling her controlling stake. The incident involving Alara had been part of a larger intimidation campaign. The authorities handled the investigation, and the people responsible were arrested. When everything was finally over, Serafina returned to the hospital where Alara had once been treated. Her daughter was healthy again, laughing and carrying a small backpack. Alara ran toward Callan and hugged him tightly. Callan froze for a second before gently hugging her back. Serafina watched them with tears in her eyes. She realized that Callan had never wanted money, recognition, or praise. He had simply seen a child in danger and acted. Months later, Serafina helped fund a community emergency training program for parents, teachers, and local workers. Callan agreed to teach some of the classes, not because he wanted to return to his old life, but because he had finally discovered a way to use his experience without losing the peaceful life he had built for Micah. Callan's medals eventually came out of the wooden box. He placed them on a shelf beside Mika's school trophies. To him, the medals no longer represented the life he had lost. They represented the lessons he had carried home. One bright afternoon, Callan stood outside the community center watching Micah and Alara race across the grass. Serafina stood beside him, smiling as the children laughed. Callan looked at his son and realized something he had never understood while wearing a uniform. Sometimes courage wasn't about running toward danger. Sometimes courage was choosing to protect someone when nobody was watching. Sometimes a second chance arrived disguised as an ordinary afternoon, a frightened mother, and a child who simply needed someone to care. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes in kindness, and leave a comment telling us what you would have done if you had been standing there that day. Your engagement helps these stories reach people who may need a little hope. And before we reach the ending, here is a special request. Comment, I believe in second chances, if you believe one act of kindness can change a life forever. Callan never forgot the moment Serafina had begged him to save her daughter. But years later, he understood that he had not only saved Alara that afternoon. Alara had saved something inside him too. She reminded him that his past did not have to control his future, that the scars he carried were not proof that he was broken, and that sometimes the greatest purpose in life is not found on a battlefield, in a boardroom, or beneath a uniform. Sometimes it is found in simply being there when someone desperately needs you. And on that bright afternoon, as the children laughed beneath the clear blue sky, the former SEAL finally stopped looking backward. For the first time in years, Callan looked forward.